Hello and welcome back to the start of another Pastor's Perspective, sponsored by Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa. My name is Brian Perez, and we are here ready to take your phone calls at 888-564-6173, 888-564-6173, live until 4 p.m. Pacific time on this Wednesday, October 32nd. Wait a minute, there's no such thing as October 32nd. It's November 1st. Happy New Month. And yes, I recycled that joke yet again. Answering your questions today, we've got Bobby Conway from Image Church in Charlotte, North Carolina. Also the guy you see on the Christianity Still Makes Sense YouTube channel. And here in the studio, making a rare Wednesday appearance, it's Brian Broderson from Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa. He's the senior pastor there. Welcome, gentlemen, to the program today.
Thank you. Thank you. Good to be here. Wednesday. Nice to be in the studio with you, Brian.
Yes, likewise.
And to see Bobby on the screen with some psychedelic overlap on his face. Bobby, Halloween was yesterday.
Right.
So
you know what? What is that? Because I'm sitting in here I see the same setup.
Yeah, it's a shadow. It's some sort of a shadow because you just moved and it changed when you moved.
So there's no light off to your right or anything like that, or?
I do have
Yeah, now it's gone.
Maybe a lava lamp or something? No, it's still there. It's on his arm now.
Yeah. Yeah, it's okay. You look...
I mean, I can...
Yeah, you look kind of...
that kind of thing.
Andy Warhol-ish, but we can live with that.
Yeah, it's totally fine.
I don't know what it is, but it is kind of weird. I'll have to figure that out tomorrow.
That's for the YouTube people. They can figure that out.
Yeah. It'll just draw more people over to the YouTube channel to see what's this Purple Bobby Conway all about. Check it out on our YouTube channel and on Facebook, too. So give us a call at 888-564-6173. We would love to chat with you today. And we're going to begin with a question that was sent in on Facebook. It is from Julie, who says, do you think God does miracles like healing for people from other religions out of love for them? If not, how would you explain very similar claims of miracles? It's very confusing. Brian, what would you say to Julie?
Well, I haven't heard that many claims of miracles from other religious groups. I mean, people can claim something, but is there evidence for it? Is it verifiable? I don't know. But going back to the original question, of course, God can do anything that he wants to do. And I think in drawing people to himself, he doesn't wait for them to get right with him necessarily, doesn't wait for them to come out of maybe some sort of false religion. A lot of times he will reach down and touch them right where they're at. And I think ultimately people are going to come to discover that it was the God of the Bible, it was the Lord Jesus that was the one who touched them. So I think that God will use those things because he's good and merciful, and he will use them to seek to draw people to himself. But I don't think that in another religious context, if somebody got healed and then just there was never any pointing to Jesus or any suggestion that Jesus might be the source for the healing, I don't think that would be a scenario that God would himself, yes, I'm going to heal this person, and people are going to think that it was done through Krishna or something like that, and that'll be okay just because, they're healed.
Yeah. Bobby, what say you?
Well, this is a tough one. In philosophy of religion, there's a whole umbrella of thought around religious experience and the cross-pollination of such experiences amongst people outside of the Christian tradition. And these experiences would relate to a plethora of answered prayers, miracles, and other such religious experiences like visions or dreams in the absence of maybe a Christian conversion. On one side, what Brian's saying, in the middle of my doubts, this was a real problem for me. As I was struggling through this and thinking about if God was to answer prayers of non-believers, and I would be okay with the fact that he does. I don't think it's the norm. I think, every time a believer gets saved, it's God answering the prayer of a non-believer to save the believer. But I do think there's stories that, would fall under the line of God's just being merciful to some people. And so could I envision how God, just out of his goodness, could offer an answer to prayer for somebody, and then they fail to give him the glory because they're not in a saving relationship? I could see that, and I don't think that that's the norm, but I think that because of the amount of stories that we have in the literature of religious experiences, that would make me think about this a little bit more. But my struggle was exactly where Pastor Brian ended up. It was, okay, God, if you do answer a prayer, or if you do give a religious experience, and then they don't get saved, wouldn't that only go to reinforce them in their false beliefs? And so if somebody is a Muslim, for example, and God does something like that to get their attention, but they still continue to worship Allah, then what if they're giving Allah the glory for something? And I guess my thought would be that was problematic for me. But when I think about it, if you're God, and you want to help people that don't believe in you, obviously everyone's sinners, but let's just, in the same way that we as humans we might offer a relational encounter with somebody that's not a believer to help them, to do something for them in a benevolent way. Can we envision that God could do the same thing? Like if our heart would be moved to do that, can we see how God would be moved to help somebody in a need, perhaps, right? And then you go, well, what's the alternative? If he doesn't do it at all, then these people maybe don't have certain help. So if he does help, then it's the risk of them being reinforced in their beliefs of, hey, Allah gets the credit or Shiva gets the credit. But I think behind all of those religious experience, you're going to have the evil one at work, but then but I could see how God could do something, and ultimately we would hope that they would turn to Christ and see that. But if they didn't, I wouldn't say that if he intervened and did something for somebody that would discount his place. It's just confusing a little bit, isn't it?
A little bit, yes. But
yeah.
But here's my thought on that. Okay, so yeah, I mean, Jesus healed people that did not go on to follow him. We know that because we can read about it in the Gospels. But they knew that it was Jesus who healed them, and they chose not to follow him for whatever reason. I just find it hard to imagine that God would go healing people and not in some way reveal to them that it was he who was healing them. And then whether they chose to follow him or believe in him, that's a different story. They might remain in their religious convictions of their traditional religion or whatever the case might be. But there would be a sense on their part that they had been touched by God. So, Matthew Perry died this past week, right? And he tells a story of how God really touched him and helped him with his drug addiction. And it was through this encounter with God that he, really was able to get a victory to some extent over this long-term addiction. but I never could. I never found out whether he acknowledged Jesus as being that God, or if it was just God in a generic sense. Everything I read was just God, but maybe that was just the people reporting on it. So did God help him? Maybe so. Did he come to put faith in Jesus? I don't know if he did or not. I think the jury's out on that. So I'm not saying that God couldn't do it or wouldn't do it in some cases. I'm just saying that I don't think he would do it secretly or without the person having any knowledge that it was actually him who was doing it,
I think the part that maybe challenges me on that a little bit is if you take religious experiences in the 1040 window, mm-hmm. and you think about maybe the stories that have happened, and you look at that and you go, wow, I mean, that's pretty powerful. Or what was happening with some of the Native Americans, even before, like the things that carried their belief system before even believing in Jesus. I think ultimately it's to point to him for sure, but if what does God do to help mm-hmm. his people? Mm-hmm. So he communicates maybe an answer to prayer. Perhaps somebody gets a healing. There's a powerful experience. And if none of that's ever happened in the 1040 window from him, where there's no gospel, then we would have to say, because we don't believe in those gods, that all those experiences, any of the miracles would be because of Satan. And perhaps Satan does good things for unregenerate people to keep them, entrenched in their false belief. So that is kind of like the predicament we're in.
Yeah, I kind of have a hard time believing Satan does anything good for anybody. So that one,
yeah, right.
He doesn't plant churches. We know that, right?
We know he doesn't plant churches. I don't think he has any compassion, but he could use it as a deceptive tool. Yeah. It's a hard thing, but Bobby, a while back, maybe a year ago, Os Guinness wrote a book called Transcendence. I think the title might be a little longer than Transcendence, but he tells the stories of a number of people. Of course, he tells C.S. Lewis's story, how he has this encounter with the transcendent and then eventually comes to Jesus. So Lewis, in the early stages of his being drawn to God, so here's where I could see something too. In the early stages of him being drawn to God, he doesn't know he's being drawn to God. He doesn't know it's the God of the Bible that's drawing him in, but he's having these experiences, which ultimately proved to have been God drawing him, because in the end he comes to put his faith in Jesus finally. So, but then Os tells signals of transcendence. Then he has some stories where there are these transcendent moments that people have, but they never follow through with it to the point of belief, So that was interesting too. So it might be that kind of situation right there where God does something in the, say, the elementary or the earliest stages of his dealings with a person, that he does things, and he does them in a sense from a hidden position. He's not revealing that mm-hmm. he's doing it, but he is doing it. And then, like in the case of Lewis and others, it proves at a certain point that God was the one doing this. So, yeah, you're right. It's a little complicated.
Yeah, Bobby?
I had the same kind of stuff in my life before I became a believer, where I had a few moments that I could look back in my unregenerate state that I didn't know how to give language to the God that I sensed moving, mm-hmm. but there were a couple of these kind of moments as well. And then, obviously my story comes and it gets completed where it makes sense of it, that it was Jesus that was working. I guess what we would have to say is does that guarantee then that anybody that's having had an experience, that can we guarantee them that they're going to end up saved, right? So I think then we would say, well, probably not, right? But then you have apostates then that have had some experiences and then they walk away. But on that side, to your point, it's clearly they would have, now they're rejecting it was Jesus, but we would say, well, that was Jesus. And then like Lewis or myself, those pre-experiences find completion, and we're able to give that signal of transcendence is Jesus, but he's the signifier behind the signified. And then there would be this other grouping. Will they ever see this come to consummation?
Yeah, and I just thought of just the whole concept of common grace, which is it's basically rooted in what Jesus said in Matthew's gospel when he said that God causes the sun to shine on the just and the unjust. He brings rain on the fields of the just and the unjust. So there is a common grace that God demonstrates toward people just simply because of his goodness. So it might very well be. But the one thing I can't see is God doing miraculous things and demonic entities getting the credit for it. That's where I don't see. When God says, "I will not give my glory to another," I think it would roll over into something like that.
Yeah, Bobby.
It's a good conversation, Brian, that we're having. It's actually helpful because it's kind of like if we were just sitting down having coffee together. I'm finding that I'm working some of my thoughts out live with you. And I like that. And I think that is the place that we should put it. So here's what we would be up against then, right? So we're saying that, there's this common grace that God's doing something. So, but if he's doing something to provide, let's say, food and nutrition, that's kind of a physical need. Well, that's still something of himself being given to humanity that some humans will never give him glory for, but they'll find out someday that it was him. So why wouldn't he, if he wanted to, be able to, out of his grace, do something else demonstrably that highlights another aspect? Maybe on one side it's providence, maybe another side it's power and through a miracle, or it's a relational component where an answer happens. But I think that the person, and that's the problem. So in other words, there's enough evidence, even if God doesn't answer a prayer, doesn't do a miracle, doesn't give an experience, everybody's still without that unregenerate, or they're going to be able to see that there was common grace given to them, that he still did stuff with creation, with conscience, and provision. So maybe there's a way that we can see that. I don't think it's his norm doing the miraculous stuff, though, at all. I'm just saying, with all that's gone on in history, some Christians would say he doesn't do it at all. And I would say, I'm not sure we can quite say that. And I don't think it's a problem if he decides to necessarily.
Yeah.
Julie, thanks for sending in your question on Facebook Messenger. Great discussion to begin today's program, the first one of the month. Give us a call. We're here till 4 p.m. Pacific time today at 888-564-6173. Brian Broderson and Bobby Conway here at 888-564-6173. And we'll go to the phones now, beginning with Eric, calling from San Bernardino, California. Hello, Eric. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, gentlemen, pastors. Good afternoon to you. My question is, I called in a while ago about, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And I talked at length about it back then. And my question, though, is this, we know that Jesus is God's perfect sacrifice. And when Jesus cried out, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? How does that coincide? Because when he was on the cross, he was certainly God's sacrifice. And we know God would not forsake his sacrifice. In fact, the whole idea behind sacrifice, if I understand it correctly, is so there is no forsaken man. But when Jesus was on the cross as God's sacrifice, in other words, how could God forsake him when this is God's sacrifice? And if he forsook his sacrifice, what sacrifice is left for our salvation? That's my question. But I also have just a quick comment about that one caller, or the one who wrote in about if there's a healing and things like that. I would just like to add to what you guys said, which was great, and that is, there could also be Christians that were praying for that person, and to them, believe me, they gave God the glory for answering their prayer for healing.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, Bobby, what would you say about God forsaking Jesus?
Well, when Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me? I mean, number one, it's the feelings that he's experiencing in the moment. It's not that he was necessarily forsaken, right? I mean, he was reunited with him. It says, for the joy set before me, endured the cross, and he sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. So as he was going to the cross, what was his joy? Knowing that he's going to be reunited with the Father with a mission accomplished. So there could be this aspect that sometimes, Jesus had a human nature. And so he was in a lot of anguish and a lot of pain. And, hey, let this cup pass by me. The cup didn't pass. He goes, he's feeling pain. There's that aspect where we talk like that a lot. We feel forsaken when we're in anguish and pain, even though we're not. So it could just be that aspect. And then some would say that the forsaken aspect was for this moment in time when he was taking the sin of humanity upon him. His human nature was forsaken in the sense that, God turns away from him in that moment as sin's placed on him. And that is another approach that people take. But it's not that he was ever forsaken. It's just the relationship certainly looked different. I mean, you got to imagine Jesus is he's the second person of the Trinity. He takes on a human nature. He lives a perfect life. And now in this moment, he's experienced the rejection of his disciples, the rejection of the authorities, both Jewish and Roman. He's getting blasted on the cross. He's in absolute excruciating pain. And now he's going to feel something, humanly speaking. He's going to feel the weight of our guilt, though he's never been guilty. He's going to feel the weight of our shame, though he never did anything to feel shame. And what does guilt and shame cause us to do? To cover ourselves. We feel forsaken. We feel cut off from the Father in our guilt. He felt alienation from the one he was always in perfect, harmonious relationship. As he takes our sins on, he felt the force of worldwide alienation from the Father for our sins in that moment. And it hit him in such a powerful way that he understood our state of forsakenness, and then yet coming out of the grave. I mean, that is an amazing thought, to think of Jesus feeling our shame and feeling our guilt, though he was never guilty and though he never deserved shame. Feeling our condemnation, though he didn't deserve it. Feeling our judgment, though he's the judge. That kind of stuff right there.
Brian, any thoughts?
Only to affirm everything Bobby said, but I would also just remind our caller, Eric, if you read through Psalm 22, because that, of course, Jesus is quoting, you have the my God, why have you forsaken me or abandoned me? Why are you so far from delivering me, from hearing my words? But then as you carry on in the psalm, you come to a point where, in verse 21, he cries out, "Save me from the lion's mouth and the horns of the wild oxen." And then he cries out at the end of the verse, "You answered me. I will proclaim your name to my brothers and sisters." So he, like Bobby's saying, he's not forsaken in the sense that there has been the idea, and I think some still hold to it, and I actually had thought this at a time, that somehow Jesus, God the Son, was being forsaken by God the Father at that moment, in sort of an eternal separation condensed into 3 hours, him bearing the sin of the world and all of that. But there's massive problems with that when it comes to the nature of God. So that's where you have to pull back and say that the forsaken is what he's, like Bobby said, what he's experiencing from the human standpoint. Jesus is human. And so from the human standpoint, he's feeling obviously very forsaken because he's the Lord's Messiah, but now he's abandoned over to this cruelty and to this death. So, but again, in the psalm itself, it's clear that he has not been forsaken because he says, "You answered me."
Bobby?
That's right. Well, I just wanted to give a shout out, Pastor B, to my dad, who texts me and says, "The lighting on your face looks horrible. You look like the devil sitting there with the purple reddish light on your face." Thanks, Dad. Appreciate that.
Yes.
leave it to Dad to not pull any punches. Brian and I are trying to be really nice to you. It doesn't look too bad. It's kind of a cool look.
Right.
Your dad's like, "Bobby, you look like the devil."
Yeah, that's right.
And now people are really logging in.
Self-esteem's all jacked up, right?
Yes. All right, Eric, thank you for your phone call today here on Pastor's Perspective at 888-564-6173. Let's see if we can do one quick one here before the break. Pebbles in Corona, California. Hello, welcome to the program.
Hi, guys. How are you?
Doing well, thank you.
All right, I have a question. The bride of Christ, is it the church or is it Israel?
Brian, what say you?
Well, the New Testament refers to the church as the bride of Christ. Paul talks about the church being the bride in both 1 Corinthians and in Ephesians. And in the Old Testament, Israel was often referred to as the wife of the Lord. And so how do you reconcile those things? Some people see that they're just two completely different things. And, the church is one people of God and Israel is one people of God. And we're all the same, but then we have this difference. I tend to think that in the end, it will all blend together, that we will be one bride, one wife of the Lord. And of course, this is just an analogy. It's not literal. It's God's just using it to speak about the depth and the intimacy of the relationship that we have with him. So that's my thought on it. I don't know if Bobby has a different take.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, my training would have been to see them distinct with the dispensational school of thought. But I just I'm like you. I just think that it runs together. I don't think there's, some separate, plan that's ultimately running. I think we're all together in this.
Yeah. Yeah. It seems kind of hard to think of, out into the future. We've got, the Lord has like two wives. It's
a polygamous.
Little.
Oh man, the Mormons were right. No, that's not it at all.
It's a little bit of a problem.
You're like, what is this? Yeah.
Pebbles, thank you for your phone call today on Pastor's Perspective. We've got to take a break, and then we'll be back with more of your questions. Monica, Martha, Steve, everyone else, hang on. We'll be with you shortly on Pastor's Perspective. Brian Broderson and Bobby Conway answering your questions until 4 p.m. Pacific time on this Wednesday, November 1st. Give us a call, 888-564-6173. 888-564-6173. Same number you see there on the bottom of your screen if you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, 888-564-6173. Hey, we're back on Pastor's Perspective. 888-564-6173 is the number to call us today until 4 p.m. Pacific Time. 888-564-6173. I'm Brian Perez, and we've got Brian Broderson and Bobby Conway here to answer your questions. 888-564-6173. A quick shout out to Lonnie, who, just as I predicted, somebody, at least a few people, were going to log into Facebook or YouTube to find out what it was about Bobby's lighting situation that caused his dad to say that he, looked like evil incarnate. So yes, we'll see if we can get that fixed by tomorrow. Anyway, 888-564-6173 is our number, and we're going to begin our second half of the program with Monica, listening in Laguna Hills, California. Hello, Monica.
Hello.
Welcome to Pastor's Perspective.
Thank you.
So you had a question about Genesis chapter 26.
Yes. At this point, when Genesis 26, verse 5, because that Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. So at this point, Moses, hadn't written or hadn't received the Ten Commandments yet. So
He wasn't even born yet.
What? Yeah. What commandments are we talking about? Statutes and laws.
Bobby, what do you say?
Well, keep in mind that God's moral law has been written on the heart of humanity. So even people to this day, when you see non-believers, for example, have a sense of right and wrong, that's because the moral law is written on their heart. It's just God doesn't get the credit for it. So you have that aspect where the moral law is imprinted on the heart. And then you would have, just some of the things that God would have spoken to Abraham. And we also need to remember that, like in Genesis 12 or in Genesis 15, where God's, sharing about promises to Abraham, or Abraham stepping out to follow God. And you see some of these different, things going on. You're in Genesis 20. You're asking about Genesis 26 though. But either way, his promise to Isaac, similarly speaking, there's stuff being passed on in oral tradition. And when we think about what we're reading in the Bible about these experiences, we're getting, I would say probably fragments of the experience. I mean, some of these moments, or if you see any laws that seem to be assumed, and then you go look at the life of Isaac, or you go look at the life of Abraham, and you're like, well, I don't see that in these encounters that they had with God, that they have any right to have known what these commandments are. But it's possible that God communicated those to them maybe on other points, and it just didn't get put into Scripture. It's kind of like if Pastor Brian was to write a script about his relationship with God, with all of his years of walking with him, and then, 5,000 years from now, 4,000 years from now, people are looking at that. Well, that doesn't necessarily catalog, and it wouldn't catalog all the experiences that he had with God. It just narrates what he wanted to share, and in the case, what you see in the Bible, with what God wanted to share in that. That's why we have very, fragmented pictures of people's life. It's like how would you like the reputation of being Doubting Thomas for the moment when he doubted? He also apparently took the gospel to India, believed by many scholars. So, we get enough that God wants us to have, but we can, assume that the Bible's not, misleading us. It's just doesn't give us all the details that we might like at certain points.
Pastor
Brian,
Brian,
what do you think about?
Yeah, I think that is true. But I also think that we're looking at these terms, statutes, instructions, commands, mandate. I'm reading the CSB. And you look back at the life of Abraham, this is what he did. God said to him, he appeared to him in his country, get out of your country and leave your family and go to a place that I will show you. That was a command that God gave him. So Abraham obeyed that. And then as Abraham went through his life, various things that God commanded him to do, told him to circumcise his children and all of those things. So those would be the things I think that are being referred to here. Just because you have similar ways of referring to the commandments that would later come through Moses and so forth, doesn't mean that there had to be something that thoroughly developed like the law of Moses that Abraham had access to. Think of Jesus. Jesus talks about us keeping his commandments. And then you say, like, well, wait, what commandments is Jesus talking about? Well, he tells us, my commandment is that you love one another. So, Jesus kind of narrows it down to one commandment, love one another and love God. Or he tells us, of course, in another place that all the law and the prophets are summed up in loving God with all your heart, loving your neighbor as yourself. So, I don't know. Does that help?
Yes, it does. And also, if I could add another little question. At the beginning, when there was two trees in the garden, the tree of knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life, so could that be it too, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, that, like you said, it's kind of like his spirit or something telling us, like a conscience telling us.
Yeah, like Bobby said.
Wrong, what is right.
Yeah, like Bobby said, Paul tells us in Romans chapter 2 that the law is written in all of our hearts. So every human being, the reason why people intuitively know right from wrong is because of the traces of the law that God originally put in the hearts of humanity when he created us. Now, sin has darkened our hearts, but there's still the traces of that law that are there.
All right, Monica, thanks for calling us today here on Pastor's Perspective. And now we go from Monica to Martha, who is listening on our website, kwave.com. Thanks for calling in, Martha. How can we help you?
Yes. Hi. Thank you for taking my call. Thank you for the program. And my question is on Dia de los Muertos, as it's here. My culture celebrates, does a memorial display, and they call it, in the old days, they used to call it ofrenda. And it's a commemoration of the loved ones that have gone to heaven, right? And what they do now, they name it now altars. And I was wondering, as a practicing Christian, can we build? Can we partake in that celebration? I know that it's a memorial display, but I know that a lot of people see it as an altar. And the word does say we're not called to do any altars. Mm-hmm. And that was my concern. And I'm torn because I have an 82-year-old mom. Mm-hmm. that needs help to build it these past years, and I have to tell her, because you call it an altar, I cannot help you. Mm-hmm. I feel bad. Mm-hmm. And I also want to, because it's my culture in Mexico, and I know I see it as a memorial more as an altar, because they're not like an altar to a god. It's not considered to that. It's just mm-hmm. to, celebrate the people that we love that have passed.
Mm-hmm. Right. Brian, what do you know?
Yeah, I don't know specifically about that practice, but I do know, say like within Japanese religion, their religion, their Buddhism is heavily dosed with ancestral worship. So they do things for people that have died, the ancestors. And I think this sounds a little bit like that. And I do think, as hard as it is, Martha, to say to your 82-year-old mother, Mom, we can't do this. There are certain things that the culture is, some aspects of culture are neutral. We can embrace them and enjoy them and just that's fine. But some aspects of culture are so tainted with sin and falsehood that we have to oppose it, resist it, or not engage in it. And I think when it comes to something like you said, I think, you're thinking about it one way because you're a Christian, but the rest of the culture is I think there's more of a dark side to this than not. Brian, do you know anything about it?
Why? Because I'm Hispanic?
Yeah.
You just think I automatically... No, I'm joking. I've actually never done Dia de los Muertos or anything like that.
Have you? But you heard of it?
I've heard of it, yes, of course. But but it's interesting, though, that you say that... oh, gosh, what was your exact quote? I don't remember. But you mentioned that, Dia de los Muertos is more, there's so much
ancestral,
but some people would say, well, Halloween has all these origins of evil and everything. So why are you saying that it's okay to do stuff on Halloween, but not Dia de los Muertos, Day of the Dead?
Well, Halloween is All Hallows Eve, so it is the night before All Saints Day. So today is All Saints Day. Did you know that?
Right. Forgot about
All Saints Day, yeah. So this was a practice, yes, in Europe. It's become radically different today than it was back in those early days. But I don't think there's a similarity, because I don't think there was ever a place where you're building any kind of altar or structure in remembrance of the dead. So, yeah.
Okay, Bobby, what say you?
So I definitely would want to make sure that we define what we mean by altar. If I was in Mexico, for example, and I was in a home and people were gathering and it was called an altar, but if the altar didn't mean any type of worship whatsoever, because I do know with the Day of the Dead, a lot of it's celebration. It's to remember. It's hopefully cathartic for people as they remember their loved ones. If they're just using a term altar, then I would just say that, okay, well then, I get that. Words can have different meanings. So if the meaning just means you've erected something as a memorial, and you want to have some laughter and memories and recall, and it's cathartic, I can understand that. If by altar means we're going to that our loved one is going to meet us in this moment and tickle us, so to speak, and be engaged in this, and we're going to believe that, then that's a real problem, because that's where you start getting into some real issues here. I think the other thing, I'm thinking a little bit about the whole eating meat that is presented to idols, and it's obviously, it's permissible for us to eat meat, if it was, done one way, even though it's not a way that we would approve, because we know there's no such thing as idols. But the moment that we realize that it might offend somebody, and that it comes across our conscience that, hey, we're participating in something with others that think that this is, something idolatrous, then we need to abstain. So I think, not knowing enough about how this plays out in Mexico, I guess I would ask, I think it was your mom, what do you mean by altar? Do you think when we do this, are we worshiping? Are we coming in contact with the dead? Is there kind of any sort of necromancy taking place? I would ask questions, and if it was like, no, we're just putting an altar, and an altar is just kind of like a stand that we put pictures on in order to remember for cathartic purposes and celebrate, well, then that feels fine to me.
What a difference between just having a picture on a wall of somebody who has passed away. It's not like the day they pass away, you're going to take their picture down. You might still leave their picture up for a while.
And I think that what Bobby just said is exactly the case. If there is no worship element in it, or if there's no prayers to the dead, or anything like that, if there's a spiritual dimension to it, then I think that's something we have to avoid. If it is simply a memorial for family members, then whatever you call it, that it's irrelevant. So I guess that's the question.
Yeah. Bobby?
You know what I do like, just thinking about this a little bit, there's almost a side that I wonder in our own country, and talking about it in the way that we're moving toward, Brian, that, I could see how it could be cathartic for families to, when somebody passes away that was like that close link.
Sure, yeah.
To get some pictures out and just have a moment and remember and laugh.
Yeah.
Because sometimes what happens is you just kind of feel like, oh, we're not allowed to do that anymore. We just need to heal. We need to get over it. And no, that person made an impact in your life. Why not talk about it?
Yeah. So Martha, can you define which it is?
Okay, so for my mother, because she is Catholic, she, how their religion is, they pray to the dead.
Right.
They pray for the dead, right?
Yeah.
So that, by you saying that, then I cannot partake. But say later on when my mom goes to heaven, and I would like to do an ofrenda, which is the Day of the Dead ofrenda altar, or whatever, however I style it, because everybody does it differently. Then for me, it would just see as a memorial. There are they are in Mexico. Certain families will use incense too. They put incense, and some of them think, oh, we'll put the food out. They'll come and eat it, but it's just a little make believe. That's their thought. We put everything that was remembered to them so we can remember them for that, that moment. And then that's it. But when you say prayer, and I'm like, well, she's Catholic, she's praying for, the person that has deceased and all the people that have been passed away, then in that sense.
Yeah, and even with that, I would I'm wanting to avoid, at all cost, is any occultic type of stuff, So Catholics are misinformed, misguided when it comes to praying for the dead and so forth. But it's not, I don't think it's the same thing as being involved in some kind of occultic practice. It's just it's a non-biblical practice that it's done out of ignorance, really. And I mean, really, the blame lays at the feet of the church leadership because they've taught people to do this, and it's not correct. So I don't even know that would be a reason to say that I couldn't do this with my mom. You might use it to share with her the truth that, people, once they die, they can't hear our prayers. We're supposed to pray to God. God alone is the one who hears and receives and answers prayer.
All right, Martha, thanks for calling us today here on Pastor's Perspective at 888-564-6173. Let's go to Mesa, Arizona, where Steve is listening on the K-Wave app. Thank you for downloading the app. Steve, how can we help you today?
Oh, thank you for the work you do in the ministry and for being truly servants of God. I'd like to know your perspective on the King James only topic. I started going to Big Calvary in 81. I remember Pastor Chuck switching to the New King James Version, even though he still used the old, the King James Version. He would use both, but sometimes I read the NASB because it's easier to read. My daughter thinks it's evil for me to use the NASB as it's Satan. And I do understand that Westcott and Hort wrote it, but please help me out. I don't want to be viewed as an evil man because I'm not reading the so-called real Bible.
Yeah. It's a little bit hard to believe that people still are hung up on that kind of stuff, and especially anybody looking at it through a Calvary Chapel lens. Pastor Chuck, he loved the King James. He grew up on it. So, anybody who's spent a lot of years in a particular kind of particular translation knows it's hard to make the switch to another version. And I've been struggling with that for a few years. But the idea, so anyway, as you mentioned, yes, Chuck did. He went from the Old King James to the New King James, and then he went back to the Old King James. And he basically went back for the reasons that I just mentioned. It was just after so many years of having one translation in your mind, it's just hard to adapt to a new translation. So it wasn't like he found something fallible with it and said, oh, I can't use this. And, the whole argument about the Westcott and Hort and all of that is really I think it's a bit of a distorted picture of Westcott and Hort and these guys in this text. All of the other translations of the Bible, beside the King James and the New King James, use the set of manuscripts that the Westcott and Hort would have been, they would have been involved with those manuscripts. So whether it's the ESV or the NIV or the CSB or the NLT or any other modern translation, they're using those texts. And I read both, and there is hardly a difference between them. And so I think this is one of those arguments that like I said, it's hard to believe that people are still squabbling over this because it's it's kind of like a non-issue. What do you think, Bobby?
Yeah, it is shocking, actually, to think that we're still discussing it. To be honest, I mean, it's incredible because, number one, we're dealing with an English translation. And so you think about all the other languages that the Bible's been translated into. We're so blessed to have the different translation copies that we have. And I've said before on the radio, I was so blown away when I showed up in Arkansas in Bible college, and then I went off to a church one Sunday afternoon, and this elderly guy came up to me and said, "Man, we had a We had a barbecue last weekend, a Bible burning fest. Everybody brought their non-King James versions out, and we roasted them on the pyre. And I looked at the guy, and I just literally, I was 21, I was 22 maybe, 22, 23. I said, you guys just done burned the Bible that the Lord used to change my life. And I just thought, this is unbelievable. That kind of zeal and zealousness. And honestly, Steve, like that, no disrespect to your daughter by any means. I think, I could understand she's just been taught by certain people, but it's really an unintelligent kind of a view to even hold to. Like the reality is across the board with scholarship, and when I'm talking scholarship, some people go, "Oh, well, we don't care what scholar." Well, I mean, that's even kind of a silly statement. Like scholars can become, off the deep end and lose sight of things. But we're talking your conservative scholars, Dan Wallace, Darrell Bach, Craig Keener, like people out there that are really gifted in this area. These people pretty much across the board are going to be using the critical text, which is going to be what your NAS is going to be on. And they're going to say that these are more reliable manuscripts than the Textus Receptus that was used in giving us the King James Version. And that's because they predate the manuscripts by 1,000 years. And that's significant. Like we should, but that's not a blow even to the KJV or New King James. Like that's great. Like if Pastor Chuck was using that because that's what he was used to, I'm totally sensitive to that. But I also, and I don't know, maybe Pastor Brian, you would know, I would imagine if with him being familiar with where the scholarship was moving, that he would even realize that the better manuscripts would be the critical text. But I don't know, because I know that KJV argument was a lot stronger in his ministry. But today I would like to think that he would agree.
Yeah, I don't know if he would agree, but I know that he certainly wouldn't. I know for a fact that he was anti-King James only. So he did not support that movement that was King James only. Yeah. He thought that was foolish.
Steve, thank you for your phone call today on Pastor's Perspective. And that is all the time we have on today's episode. So sorry that we couldn't get to all of your calls, but we will be back tomorrow. In fact, tomorrow is Thursday. You know what that means. We're going to be here for 2 hours. So call us between 3 and 5 p.m. Pacific time, and you can chat with us then. Pastor Brian Broderson, thank you for coming in on a Wednesday.
Well, you're welcome. It's my pleasure.
Yes, Bobby Conway, thank you for logging in.
Yes, good to see you
on this Wednesday. And we will talk to you all tomorrow here on Pastor's Perspective, sponsored by Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa.